we have spent 90, something like 96, 97% of human history, we've been nomadic hunter gatherers, possibly more, but let's say it's around 96, 97%. So most of human history, we've been living in a very low technology environment. And so we've evolved to deal primarily with a low technology environment, small bands of people working together constantly, very much immersed in nature, immersed in dynamic problem solving, solving problems which are very concrete for most of our history. Where do we get food? Where do we get water? But over the past few, 1,000 years, again, very, very small sample of human history, we've developed agriculture, civilization, and now, most recently, in the past couple of 100 years, the Industrial Revolution, and now in the past, like 20, 30 years, the internet, smartphones, in the past 3 years, large language models going mainstream. It's getting really intense. I think you can make a strong argument that the human brain isn't evolved to deal with this level of technology. One way I like to put it is we're victims of our own success.
Hello, and welcome to The Examined Life with me, Kenny Primrose. If you have tuned in hoping for some revision hacks or exam tips, then I'm afraid you'll leave disappointed. None of that is on today's menu. But if you're here because you want to grow wiser by listening to thoughtful voices discuss what truly matters, then you're in the right place. The title of the podcast comes from that famous line attributed to Socrates: "The unexamined life is not worth living." This podcast is my small attempt to create a space where we can examine life together. It's been a while since the last episode, and today marks the beginning of a fresh phase for the show. While I work on the next full season, I'll be releasing occasional long-form conversations like this one, alongside shorter espresso-style episodes that draw out a single insight you can take with you. You can get all of these straight to your inbox by signing up to This Examined Life on Substack, and you can support the show there too. Today, I am speaking with Dr. Alex Curmi. You may recognize him from his TED Talk or his work on the Thinking Mind podcast. Alex is a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and a gifted communicator. Together, we explore what modern technology is doing to our minds and how we might prepare ourselves for a future of increasingly capable machines. I found the conversation both illuminating and genuinely practical, and I hope you do too. If you do enjoy the show, please follow or rate it. It really helps others to find it. Thank you. Dr. Alex Curmi, it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Kenneth. Thank you for inviting me.
There's, as you know, the theme of the podcast is to explore a question that an influential thinker, someone like yourself, thinks we should be asking, and we will absolutely come to that question. But I wondered if we might begin by hearing a little bit about you. You're a psychiatrist, you're also a psychotherapist, you also host the Thinking Mind podcast and do some writing and some speaking. So I wonder if you could tell us your journey. What have been the themes that have guided you to where you are?
Yeah, so I think the biggest theme that's guided me, which I'm happy that I let myself be guided by this theme, was I let myself be followed by my interests without any one decision needing to be the best ultimate decision. Around 18 or 19, I had to decide what I wanted to study at university. And I liked biology and chemistry and science. And I liked the idea of understanding the physiology of the human body. So I chose medicine. It seemed like a logical route. But then when I started medical school, in the middle of medical school, I started to intuit pretty quickly that maybe a more conventional medical career as a GP or internal medicine specialist probably wasn't going to be for me. Within medical school, I then found psychiatry. So immediately I'm really fascinated by psychiatry, the dark aspects of the human mind, what can go wrong for people mentally, behaviorally, etc. So I decided to specialize in psychiatry after doing 2 or 3 years of general medicine and surgery and geriatrics. I then started training in psychiatry. I like psychiatry, but there were certain aspects of psychiatry which weren't fully satisfying to me. And then I discovered psychotherapy. When you train as a psychiatrist, you get to experience a bit of psychotherapy. You get to try out cognitive behavior therapy with a patient and psychodynamic therapy with a patient. And then I really fell in love with that kind of thing. Alongside my psychiatric training, I started a psychotherapy training program, which I'm about to finish in 6 to 9 months. In parallel to all of that, I love learning and teaching. And I felt there should be better online resources for people to learn about mental health, psychology, and self development. Roughly at the same time that I started psychotherapy training, I started a podcast, which has now become a weekly podcast where I talk to expert guests or sometimes just riff by myself on a variety of topics. That's been super fun. So that's been three prongs of my career, mostly have been psychiatry, psychotherapy, and now podcasting and some speaking and writing. But it's all centered around my interests, which is the mind, behavior, why people do what they do, what steps can people take to live a higher quality of life. These are the things I'm interested in. And I've been fortunate that I've been able to build a career on those things.
Okay, fascinating. Thank you. And do you find that the psychiatry is obviously medically based? Psychotherapy is much more talk therapy. Are they comfortable bedfellows for you? Do you use kind of both interchangeably?
That's a good question. I think for many people, they're not comfortable bedfellows. But I think for me, they are. And that's because I'm comfortable with the tension that can arise between them. In many ways, a psychiatric approach can complement a psychotherapeutic approach, but that doesn't mean there are differences and tensions that arise between them. For example, if someone presented with symptoms like intrusive thoughts, and as a result, they felt compelled to do certain things, through a psychiatric lens, those would be symptoms of a disorder, possibly something like OCD. Those are symptoms or misfirings of your brain worth treating and kind of mm, almost getting rid of, might be a crude way to put it. Whereas if you view the same set of issues psychotherapeutically, you'd say, no, actually, these are coping strategies. They're coping strategies that a person has developed to deal with uncertainty. Perhaps they had a very unstable or inconsistent childhood environment. And this was their brain's best attempt to deal with that uncertainty and instability. Now that they're an adult, the same set of coping strategies isn't working so well. So we have to help the patient become more aware of that and hopefully develop newer, better coping strategies. So that's one example of the way a psychiatric view and a psychotherapeutic view can be in conflict with each other. If you want to be in both, you just have to be okay with that conflict and to know sometimes one approach might be better than another, more appropriate. Sometimes a patient might prefer one approach over another. You might have one patient who has that same set of problems I described, and they're like, I don't want to learn about myself. I don't really want to go into my childhood. I would like you to give me some skills and strategies and potentially some medication to help make my mental life easier. And who am I as a professional to say that's an inappropriate way of dealing with it? Someone else might be like, no, I don't really want to take medication. I want to get to the root cause of this. And therefore, a psychotherapeutic approach might be more appropriate. There's all sorts of reasons why one might be more appropriate than the other. So the way I think about it is just try and figure out what view is most appropriate at that time for that
Mm.
person. Even within psychotherapy, there's many different schools of thought, and I'm familiar with a few of them. Even in that world, I have to decide, is a cognitive behavioral approach better, or is a psychodynamic way of thinking about this patient more appropriate? And so a lot of my career has been trying to figure out all of these different lenses you can take on human problems, and then being comfortable deploying different lenses in different situations at different times. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Okay, really interesting. And actually, not a bad segue into the question that we're going to explore. Some of the things that surface in psychiatry will always have surfaced, or psychotherapy. It will be attachment issues and things like that. But as we both know, we've been living through a fairly tumultuous time. The things around us are changing, and that is showing up in your clinical work, the way we're affected by particularly technology. I wonder if we might use that as a step into what your question is. Alex, what is the question that you think we should be asking ourselves and exploring at this current moment?
Firstly, I'd like to say I love your format. I love centering an episode around the question like that. I think it's really good. The question I landed on was, and it's been something I've been thinking and writing about quite a lot, in a world where technology has been quite disruptive psychologically for a lot of people, how do we prepare for an increasingly technological future? Because we live in a technological world, but we're not at the end of history. This is not the end of the line. Changes continue to intensify every single day. So the question is, how do we go preparing for that?
It's a great question, and it's one that I think it's definitely in the back of my mind. As a parent, I'm thinking, how do I help my children prepare for a future which is in so many ways unknown? And what I can see coming doesn't fill me with hope. Actually, it terrifies me in lots of ways. Let's take the first part of what you just said. In a world where technology has already been so psychologically disruptive, what's bubbling up for you there? What is the technology that you see surfacing psychologically as trouble?
Well, to frame this, I've been doing a bit of research about this. We have spent 90, something like 96, 97% of human history, we've been nomadic hunter gatherers, possibly more, but let's say it's around 96, 97%. So most of human history, we've been living in a very low technology environment. And so we've evolved to deal primarily with a low technology environment, small bands of people working together constantly, very much immersed in nature, immersed in dynamic problem solving, solving problems which are very concrete for most of our history. Where do we get food? Where do we get water? How do we avoid a predator? How do we survive this next weather event or this next famine? But over the past few, 1,000 years, again, very, very small sample of human history, we've developed agriculture, civilization, and now, most recently, in the past couple of 100 years, the Industrial Revolution, and now in the past like 20, 30 years, the internet, smartphones, in the past 3 years, large language models going mainstream. It's getting really intense. I think you can make a strong argument that the human brain isn't evolved to deal with this level of technology. One way I like to put it is we're victims of our own success. Something that makes us human is our strong desire to innovate. The fact that we can imagine a better future than we have. A dog can't appraise the present, figure out what's wrong with it, and then imagine a better future. But a human can do all of those things. So we create lots of technologies that help us get that better future. We think, wouldn't it be nice to have control over hot water, rather than just having to rely on a hot spring? Wouldn't it be nice to have water that's hot, that's piped directly into our cave? At some point in human history, someone saw this as a problem and imagined it could be different. And now it is different. The problem is that these very seductive innovations and technologies don't just add to our lives in a static way and make our lives better. A lot of technology is very seductive upfront, but surreptitiously very depleting. So it gives us a lot on the front end, but it takes in a kind of deceptive way. So an example might be, because we have cars, we don't have to walk so much. That's amazing. That's so convenient. Doesn't it feel good when you're tired to be able to just call an Uber and have someone drive you to where you're going? You don't even have to speak to them now. You can just click a few buttons and that'll happen. But the ability to walk long distances is very important for human health. So upfront, we get this convenient technology that feels really good emotionally. It makes us feel good because we feel like we're saving energy.
Hmm.
But over the long term, if you always drive, you always get driven places, but you never walk, that's going to have a serious impact on your health. It really is the case that this is impacting people's lives. So, for example, we know older people, as a result of not walking, are much frailer. Because of that frailty, they're much more likely to fall, break their hip. As a result of breaking their hip, going to hospital, getting a chest infection. This is a very common reason why people actually die. So it's not trivial by any means. And that's just one example of the way that technology can make a world that's very comfortable, but then kind of rob us of our most human qualities. So that's an example.
Great example. There's so much that came to mind when you were speaking there. I had on the podcast a while ago Anna Lemke, the psychiatrist, who
Hmm.
her focus is dopamine, and she says we evolved in a world of scarcity and now live in one of abundance. And she
Right.
thinks we've got to, in some way, go against our biology. As you say, we're into energy conservation, but this is to a fault when your muscles atrophy and you don't bump into people on the way to the shop, the social connection, and so on. I think there's also something there on convenience technology robbing us of any sense of mastery. Albert Borgman, the philosopher, talks about central heating. It's the flick of a switch on a thermostat. There's no sense of engagement or mastery in that, as opposed to building a fire, which you have to tend. It ends up being kind of a social as well as a physical thing. What are the psychological ones that you're regularly seeing, living in a world of such kind of, before we even get into large language models and things like that?
I think the psychological ones are ones that you've already kind of hinted at. I think people are feeling a lot less confident in themselves, a lot less confident that they can overcome difficulties, intolerant to uncertainty, because in many ways, technology, I don't think it provides certainty, but it provides the illusion of certainty a lot of the time. I think it robs people of the experience of going through something uncomfortable in order to make themselves stronger as a result. I think it also robs people of sensitivity to joy and to kind of natural experiences. So, an example might be someone who is addicted to video games. And I don't want to fully knock video games. Many people play video games and have a good relationship with them. But if you're addicted to video games, many people report that it's very overstimulating. And so there's kind of a numbing effect where if you spend all day on video games or even something like TikTok, you might be less able to appreciate a sunset. Those technologies are acting on the same kind of reward systems that might respond to something in the natural environment. The way biology works is there's often a balance. If you overstimulate, there has to be a period of recovery. Overstimulating your brain with technology makes you much less able to appreciate things that happen naturally. Another example is pornography, where people who are addicted to pornography will commonly report it's much harder to get aroused when they're with their partner, because their partner, even though they're a real person, can't compete with the ridiculous variety of images and the intensity that one can experience with pornography. Drugs are another example where if you use cocaine, that causes something like 1,000% increase in dopamine release between nerve cells over baseline. If you do a lot of cocaine regularly, you're going to find it a lot harder to get reward and motivation from, say, your job or getting a promotion. So these are a few of the psychological consequences. Also, I mean, this is less related to technology itself, but more our culture. Our culture has stopped talking about, I think, morality, character building, notions of integrity. I think we're really feeling the psychological effects of that as well. So those are a few examples. So I
Those
mean, social skills. One more example, social skills. Because it's so easy to spend so much time alone because of technology, a lot of people appear to be finding, especially younger people, it's harder to form and maintain relationships, which is so important. So those are a few examples.
really helpful, and I could kind of structure where we go next. What comes to mind is the mental health crisis, the current meaning crisis, as it's been called. This seems closely related to an absence of social connection, but also, as you say, morality and character and a sense of struggle. There's something about struggle that's kind of constitutive of flourishing. You mentioned, let me relay a few things, and maybe we can explore them. Lack of confidence. I'd love to hear a bit more about why you think that's the case.
I think it's tied to the fact that it's easier to not voluntarily expose yourself to difficult situations and
Hmm.
overcome them. Because I think that's the essence of confidence. There's a really good book about confidence written by the same author who wrote The Winner Effect. And he defines confidence as this sense that you can do something and you will do something. So I'm confident that I can do this podcast and have this conversation with you because I know I can. I know I have the capability and I know I will. I have the willpower. But this didn't happen overnight, right? The reason I feel confident doing a podcast with you is because I've done around 150 to 200 podcasts in the past. So it's not like I started from a place of totally not being able to do it and then all of a sudden I can do it. It's a gradual process of trial and error, of being very comfortable with failure, comfortable with making a mistake in a public setting, people thinking less of me because they might see me making a mistake in public or something like that. So I think Confidence ultimately is arriving at this ability where you know you can do it because you have proof. I have the proof in my memories of all the podcasts I've done. But to get to that point, you have to be you have to be super comfortable with discomfort. You have to be comfortable figuring out, okay, where am I definitely competent? And then maybe going outside that a little bit, pushing the edge. In psychology, this is called the zone of proximal development. You do that again and again over months and years, and you get results from the world that tell you you're on the right track. You also get results from the world that tell you you're on the wrong track and maybe you should do something differently. Hopefully, you pay attention to that feedback from the world and that informs how you go about whatever activity you're going about. So, if an audience member gives me some constructive feedback, I might take that into account the next time I do a podcast. You do that over years and then you arrive at a position of confidence. But increasingly, it feels like there's a culture of, not wanting to fail, not wanting to put yourself in a position of discomfort at all. A lot of the discomfort that people face in modern society is discomfort that's thrust upon them as opposed to voluntarily sought out. And that has a very different psychological dynamic. I think when discomfort is forced upon us, we tend to feel oppressed and restricted. Like, for example, if housing prices skyrocket and you can't afford a house, that feels like oppression. That doesn't feel like a self development activity. And rightly so, it's difficult. But conversely, if you find something uncomfortable and you chase it, you voluntarily go into it, psychological research would suggest that makes you a stronger, more resilient person. So, to the extent that none of this is encouraged and the culture continues to regress away from that, people are going to be feeling a lot less confident, I think.
Yeah, it's a really important point, especially I think when you're working with young people, developing an inner locus of control, a sense of agency, and they say this sense that you are able to do something. When that is replaced by helicopter parenting and
Mm.
never being in risky situations, you never develop a sense of being able. There's a kind of feebleness of mind that comes with it. Jonathan Haidt argues that we've gone from physical safetyism to psychological safetyism, hence cancel culture, trigger warnings, that kind of thing. Because there's this kind of phobia of discomfort that is not just perceived as real because you've never experienced it. I wonder if the same experience is true for you. When I began a podcast and began to write a bit more, and I suppose do something that felt a bit daring, there's something a little bit daring about putting your voice out there. I've had a tremendous feedback of feelings of agency and confidence. It's not that it's always gone well or that I've triumphed. It's just that you try this thing out and you realize that the ground doesn't open up beneath you and you can try it again and get better at it.
Having a podcast is one of the things that's single handedly improved my confidence almost more than anything
Mm.
else. And I've worked in really high stress environments in A&Es and psychiatric wards. Obviously, those also helped my confidence. But there's something about the podcast in that it's totally self driven. I'm not part of a system or an institution. I had to do it all. You have to do it all yourself. You're in charge, you're the boss. That really, really improves your confidence because you start to be able to rely on your own ability to make things happen in the world rather than just plugging into an existing system. You can plug into an existing system and learn great skills and confidence. But there's something about having something that's yours that could be a podcast or a business or anything you could think of that engenders that sense of agency, that sense of I can exert an effect on the world. I can make my desires into some form of reality. Even if you're not wildly successful, you feel like you're just a little bit more grounded in reality because really you are. If you have something you want to do and try your best, you are less grounded in fantasy and more grounded in reality. So, for example, if you're like the prototypical adolescent in the parents' basement who thinks, I could write an amazing novel, I just don't feel like it, or I don't think it's worth writing an amazing
Mm.
novel. You're in a fantasy world, but you're fantasizing about this amazing novel you're going to write and you're not learning anything and you're not really grounded in reality. As soon as you set pen to paper and start to produce something. Maybe you write a chapter or a short story, or maybe eventually you do write that novel, and then God forbid you show it to someone, to your friend, or your teacher, or a literary agent. All of those actions put you further into reality and allow you the chance to get feedback from reality so you actually know where you're at. You know what's
Mm.
going on. But while that stuff's all in your head, you're just adrift in a fantasy world. And I worry about that a lot. Ian McGilchrist, who I think you had on your show,
Yeah.
he uses the word simulacrum, which maybe is the best word, is that a lot of people live in a simulated, almost reality that's not quite reality.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I wonder whether you notice a difference in the generations that come into your clinic, as in the problems that they bring. Do you notice people who are middle aged have developed agency because of the times they grew up in, and those of a younger generation, much less so? Is that something that surfaces just because of the formative years and the technology that's around when you're going through that?
I think every generation will have its kind of pros and cons. What I do see with younger people that's an advantage is I think a lot of young people are more aware of the possibility of mental health problems, how to handle them proactively. That actually self care, you can think about self care in a corny Instagram way, but I actually think self care is really important. A lot of young people are thinking about psychological and personal development. That's really good. But I do think maybe the downside of being in the younger generation is there does seem to be an increasing sense of safetyism, of overreach of psychiatric concepts like diagnosis and concepts like trauma. This is something that I have discussed on my podcast. And so it's a mixed bag. But yeah, I do see some of those trends we've alluded to so far. One thing that I have heard anecdotally from a lot of my friends in the working world is that when they work with younger people, say people from Gen Z, it seems like a lot of them have problems with confidence, anxiety, social skills. But then there's a small minority of people from Gen Z who are the most competent you'll ever meet. So these seem, and this might lead into how we might think about these difficulties and what a person can practically do. But there does seem to be a small minority of people from the younger generations that are actually able to take advantage of all the pros of technology and actually be hyper competent and really reliable and things like that.
It's interesting, this irony that we've never had such power and such reach, and yet it's kind of crippled a lot of people in terms of what they feel able to do. You mentioned that there's an intolerance towards uncertainty. And I take from that that technology gives the illusion of control, yet we still live in a world which is uncontrollable.
Right. Uncertainty has always been a problem. I'm sure the people around in 1905 couldn't have predicted a basically apocalyptic World War that started around 1914. And then not only that, but then the same thing would repeat itself with like 10 times the casualties 20 years later. There's no way they could have predicted that. And there's no way we're going to be able to accurately predict now what's going to happen in the next 20 or 30 years. We can have some ideas and maybe some principles. We're probably going to be wrong. And so I think tolerance to uncertainty is necessary for everyone. And I also think it's a hallmark of psychological maturity. And what you find is when people are unable to tolerate uncertainty, usually different psychological problems develop. So one is like obsessive compulsive type patterns are a really common response to not being able to tolerate uncertainty. As I mentioned in my example at the beginning, someone in a kind of unstable childhood environment may develop these tendencies to cope. Perfectly rational response by the brain, kind of a beautiful response in a lot of ways, that the mind is trying to create these systems and thought patterns to give this sense of predictability. But we know it's kind of an illusion. We know it's kind of not real. And technology feeds into this. We can use air conditioners to precisely control the temperature we live in. We can contact Amazon and have something made in a factory in a different country delivered to our homes the next day. And so this gives us this profound sense of control of our reality. But then things happen we would never predict. COVID was a good example. For many people who experienced COVID had never experienced anything like it, where the rug is really pulled out from under them in a way that's never happened before. It was really interesting to watch a lot of people's response to COVID and lockdowns. A lot of people were responding like it was bad customer service. Like, what do you mean? What, I just can't leave my house? This is outrageous. But to people who might have lived through World War One or World War Two, this might have been business as usual. Every so often, something cataclysmic happens, which changes the way we live radically, and you kind of have to roll with the punches. But I think this is new for a lot of people, but it shouldn't be. I think we should
Mm.
do our best to inoculate ourselves to uncertainty.
How do we do that? So I think you're right to point the finger at technology. Oliver Berkman's got this nice observation that um, it's somehow more frustrating to wait 2 minutes for something to cook in the microwave than it is to wait 2 hours for something to cook in the oven. Is this sense that we have these godlike powers, and if it's that quick, it should be quicker than that. There's a kind of sense of entitlement that comes with the powers we have. So, how do you coach yourself into a place where uncertainty becomes a tolerable reality?
One thing I've noticed with my mind, and I think a lot of people will be able to relate to this, is I try and anticipate future problems and all of the different variables that might be associated with those problems. And then I try and account for them and solve for them in that moment. This is normally 3 a.m. when I'm trying to sleep. I think, okay, so if this particular question pops up in the exam, I'll be able to deal with it this way and that way. And if the next exam I take after that is more focused on these topics, this is how I prepare. Your brain is constantly trying to account for any number of different problems that could occur in the future and plan for them. That is intolerance to uncertainty. That is my way of not being able to recognize that a situation is going to occur in the future and I'm just going to have to handle it as it comes up. For example, another example might be you might buy a house and the plumbing might go, or the electricity might go, or you might have to change the boiler. And you think, if this happens, I'll do that. If that happens, I'll do that. Something I've tried to do instead, which I have found really helpful, is to develop what I call trust in my future self. I know there's a limited amount of actions I should take now. If I'm buying a house, I should definitely have a surveyor look at it and make sure it's sound and make sure there's nothing overtly wrong with it. But the amount of actions I can take in the present are limited. I have to understand at a deep level that things will pop up that I'm not able to predict. And I have to trust that my future self can handle it. I can look back at the evidence of things I've done before and other problems I've handled and be like, okay, I am someone who can solve problems. I don't have to anticipate any problem I'm going to run into months or years in advance. When I encounter unpredictable problems in the future, I will be able to handle it. And I found that personally as a very relaxing kind of mindset. And to really to develop a high resolution sense of what is in my control and what's outside of my control and what's realistically, what dials can I move and which ones I can't.
Yeah, it's very much the kind of stoic or serenity prayer, like give me the wisdom to know the difference between what
Yeah.
I can and what I can't. It seems intimately related to a lack of confidence. If we trust that we've got agency to deal with what unknown beast is around the corner, then we're not going to be anxious. But if you feel this lack of confidence to deal with the situation, then you try and game it.
So this podcast is a good example. If I was less experienced in podcasting, I could have tried to anticipate any possible question you could ask me. I could have tried to memorize a script of different answers because if I don't memorize it, I might flub a word or
Hmm.
say something stupid or use an example that's not particularly appropriate. But that doesn't really work because there's too many different things that could come up. There's too much unpredictability. So instead, what I did was I prepared, I wrote notes, I have a rough idea of things I could talk about and answers I could provide, but I'm also going to have the courage to let myself speak and let myself think out loud. Let the chips fall where they may. It won't be perfect, but perfection is neither attainable nor desirable, I think.
100%. I think of there's a German sociologist called Harmut Rosa who talks about the uncontrollability of the world and our desire to control it. He says what we lose when we try and control things too much, like a conversation, there's a kind of turgidness that comes with it. And his word, at least the English translation, is resonance. You lose any sense of resonance by controlling. I wonder if this is a nice segue into your other point, which I love, that we've become insensitive to joy and experience. So I wonder if you could say something about how we've lost joy and experience in the way that we're living with machines.